All right. What if I told you that a man spent 18 years in jail for a crime he didn't commit, only to be set free and then immediately go back to jail for life?
Okay, where to begin? We are talking about Steven Allen Avery, who is an American man who served 18 years in prison from 1985 to 2003 for the rape and attempted murder uh, of a woman known as Penny Bernstein. And his conviction was eventually overturned because of DNA evidence that pointed to another individual. In 2005, so he gets out in 2003, has his freedom for a couple years, and then in 2005 he was again charged with murder in a different case and was found guilty 2 years later. And this whole thing that we're talking about right now obviously probably doesn't come too much of a surprise to you that are watching this. This is the subject of a documentary series called Making a Murderer that premiered in 2015 on Netflix, and had a second update to that documentary series in 2018.
Yeah. So the documentary is actually very interesting because the filmmakers were a bunch of graduate students in the University of Wisconsin who found out about Steven Avery, who was in jail for 18 years for a rape and assault that he didn't commit. And what they wanted to do for their thesis project was, all right, wrongfully convicted, he's coming out. How is he going to assimilate back into the public? So they were going to film him. And the documentary was originally intended for this guy being in jail for most of his adult life and then coming out and reassimilating back into society. We'll get into everything that happened, but what they sort of ended up doing, these filmmakers, was just kept the cameras rolling because what turned out to be was Manitowoc County made a murderer. So let's start with the Penny Bernstein case. You can see the pictures that Mr. Smith and I have behind us, the Avery salvage yard, and you can see the sign in my window and the actual salvage yard in Mr. Smith's window. On Avery Road, the Averys lived, and they were not really well-liked people. They're kind of thought to be the scum of Manitowoc County, and they had a lot of brush-ins with the law. They had a rap sheet. Stephen Avery had a rap sheet. When he was young, he got in trouble for a couple small things. Well, one thing was not really so small. One thing was some petty robberies, and then he abused an animal. What happened was Penny Bernstein was a very affluent, well-known person in the community. Her family owned some businesses in the community, and one day she was out for a jog on the beach. She was assaulted and raped. And when she was in the hospital and the detectives were investigating and asking her questions, one of the detectives said, "Well, that sounds just like Stephen Avery from the description," which obviously doesn't mean Stephen Avery did it, but
Strike number one.
yeah, but he was found guilty and spent 18 years in jail. And it wasn't until later on where they did DNA evidence and they tested DNA under her fingernails, Penny Bernstein's fingernails, and realized that it was somebody else. And that gentleman actually committed 2 rapes that Manitowoc County knows of, while Steven Avery was in jail and this guy was on the loose. So that brings us to the Teresa Halbach murder, because what happened was, after the Penny Bernstein situation, Steven Avery gets out. The state of Wisconsin has a restitution policy. So meaning, like, if you are wrongfully convicted, you are entitled to some damages in the forms of money and things like that, because obviously you couldn't work while you're in jail, help you get back on your feet and things like that. Well, when some politicians are taking a look at that, they realized, well, he's been gone for 18 years. That's not really enough to help him get back on his feet, this poor guy. So they draft a Avery bill named after Steven Avery, and that is to give the cap on what you could give somebody, make it higher. So Steven Avery and other people who are wrongfully convicted would actually get more money. Simultaneously, Steven Avery is also suing Manitowoc County for this wrongful conviction because of all the negligence. And when a police department gets sued, they have almost like a doctor has malpractice insurance. Police departments kind of have almost like malpractice insurance. Well, the insurance company, when they kind of looked into this Penny Bernstein case, said, no, Manitowoc County totally messed this up. They did not do DNA evidence. They did not have a good sketch to find a good suspect. They didn't look for other suspects. So the officers themselves will have to pay the $36 million that Steven Avery is suing them for. So between the Avery bill being named after Steven Avery and looking bad for Manitowoc County, and the officers of Manitowoc County having to foot the bill for being sued, all of the rest we're about to tell you all happens as a result, and we'll leave it up to you guys at the end what you think happens from the evidence. All right, so the first thing we're going to talk about, piece of evidence, is Teresa Halbach, who she is, how she got to the Steven Avery property. So Teresa Halbach was a photographer. A bit of freelance here and there, but she did work for some companies. One of them was Auto Trader, where she would go to people trying to sell automobiles, take pictures of them. The people would pay her to take those pictures and put them in the magazine to make it easier. Because the Averys had the Avery Salvage Yard, they often would fix up cars or buy cars cheaply from other people and try to sell them for a profit or whatever. So Teresa Halbach came, like she would every once in a while, to take a picture of a van. And the day she goes missing, on October 31st, one of the last people she saw was Steven Avery. Now, she was driving this green RAV4 that you see in the corner here. And when she goes missing, a few days later, and I believe it was November 3rd, November 3rd, there's a search party, and the search party asks if they can go to this, look at the Avery Salvage Yard to see if they can find anything, find her camera, find her purse, find her car, whatever. And lo and behold, they find the car, and they find it like this. And that's why I want to show this as the first piece of evidence, because it's a salvage yard. They have a car crusher. There's eyewitnesses, members of Steven's family, says he was crushing cars the day before the search party found the car. And here is how it's hidden. Now, again, Steven Avery is not a man of high intelligence, but when you're crushing cars the day before and you killed somebody, I believe you'd probably crush the car that has evidence of the person you killed inside of it and not just throw a couple sticks or boards over it. But that's what we have. What do you say, Mr. Smith?
Yeah, so if you look over my shoulder, you can see how many cars we're talking about in the salvage yard. That's just a small portion of the cars. You send a search party. I mean, the details surrounding the people who found this car in the search party, they literally were looking for maybe 10, 15 minutes. And almost, coincidentally, they found it right off the bat. I mean, if you're gonna look for a RAV4 in the sea of cars, and it's pretty much, you're gonna walk up a road and boom, there it is. It's almost, I'm not saying they knew where it was, but it's almost like they knew where it was.
Yeah.
Again, leave that up to your imagination.
Yeah. So I'm going to share my screen again for the next piece of evidence. We're going to talk about the blood that was inside the RAV4. Oh, pop up. There we go. And you can see right here by the key. Now, you're going to hear, if you watch the Making a Murder documentary, you're going to hear about the prosecution and Ken Kratz say there was sweat DNA under the hood, meaning that Steven Avery lifted it up. First off, I'll leave that to Mr. Smith another time to talk about. There's really no such thing as sweat DNA. Maybe there was like, meaning there was sweat and there was skin flakes and other things, but I'll leave that to the science guy. But that they also found Steven Avery's blood inside the car, which obviously then would put Steven Avery inside the car. If you look at this picture here, there is blood it is squiggly like he turned the key. Like if he had a cut finger and his blood then, and turned the key, his blood would then end up on here. And you can see in this next picture that he did have a cut on his finger when they were investigating him. They were taking samples and things like that. So that would all suggest that maybe he was inside the car. Here's the thing. No fingerprints on door handle. No fingerprints on the steering wheel. No fingerprints of Steven Avery's anywhere inside the car, which suggests he wore gloves. If he wore gloves, then how can an open bleed all over the car? Okay, and we're going to talk about in a few moments EDTA and a vial of his blood, and you guys can make some conclusions with that. But Mr. Smith, do you have anything you want to talk about with the blood inside the car?
Yeah. I mean, you basically said it all with there's no fingerprints, but yet there's blood. So how is he leaving blood but no fingerprints? The sweat DNA situation is there. You're right. There's no such thing as sweat DNA. If you're sweating and your bare skin is rubbing up against something, you might shed some skin cells, and there might be some cells with viable DNA in the nuclei of those cells. But there's you're someone who's sweating. There's no DNA in the actual sweat. You'd have to have some sort of skin cells or some sort of cells that you're shedding. So their explanation is, Steven Avery was kind of a portly guy. He was sweating. He unhooked the battery underneath the hood. He leans over and his belly rubs up against the hood latch. And that's where they got the DNA. But much like this quarantine and coronavirus thing we're going through, where people use words that don't make sense to science people. If you're a prosecutor in this case, don't say sweat DNA, because it doesn't make sense.
Now, again, because this is obviously an educational video we're making, if the prosecution wanted to say it was some kind of bodily fluid, the only bodily fluid you can get DNA from would be saliva, semen, and urine. Is that correct, Mr. Smith?
Yeah, and again, in the urine and the saliva, you'd have to have some viable cells of some sort, and it would have to be collected rather immediately, or somehow preserved. Because if somebody urinates on the ground and 4 days later you come over and you try to get some DNA from that, it's probably not going to happen. So again, a lot of it is going to depend on the conditions, the environmental conditions, what is preserved, what kind of cells or DNA is preserved in that sample, and so on.
So this was a big piece of evidence with the blood and the sweat DNA on the car, because they said that proved that Steven Avery was in and around the car and had her body in the car and things like that. So if they're going to try to say, the prosecution, that there were some kind of bodily fluids on the hood latch, that would probably mean he either drooled on it, like he licked it, which would be weird, or his semen or urine was on it, which would also be weird if he's peeing inside the car. So nonetheless, yeah, that almost is actually irrelevant evidence, don't you think?
Yeah. I mean, no doubt he was probably a weird dude, but I don't know. That just seems unorthodox.
Yeah, we know he doesn't wear underwear. That was proven also in the documentary.
It is also a fact. Fun fact of Steven Avery.
Yeah. So going back to the blood inside the RAV4, I'm going to scroll down here to another picture. And so when Steven Avery was arrested and in jail for 18 years for that rape of Penny Bernstein that he did not commit, it was proven he did not commit. when you are processed and go into jail, they do a medical examination, because if you're sick, they'll put you in a separate area in the jail to make sure you're okay, because they don't want you to infect the other inmates or anything like that. So they take blood, and they take blood in a vial, and then they kind of keep it to the side. So in his case, they had a blood vial, and when Steven's lawyers for the Teresa Halbach murder went to go check out this vial of blood, first off, they found it even 18, 19, 20 years later, it was still liquid. And it's still liquid. It didn't dry up in the vial because of a substance called EDTA. We mentioned this in our OJ video. So you can always go back to our OJ video and watch that so you can hear a little bit more about EDTA. But so it was still liquefied blood. And what they also found was that there was a puncture in the top of it. Now, if you look right here, the evidence casing where the vial was kept in, the seal is broken on it, and there's no tape over it, but you can see that other people that have opened up this case, this box, have put new evidence tape over it and put their initials on it, because that is the chain of custody. Every time you check out evidence, you have to put your name on it so they know who looked at this evidence and when. But here it's broken, it's not resealed, and there's no evidence tape or marking of who looked at it. So somebody opened this, we just don't know who. And if you look at the vial of blood here, you will see that there is a puncture wound at the top. So what Steven Avery's lawyers and his defense lawyers said was that Manitowoc County Police Department, somebody there took this box, opened up Steven Avery's blood, took a needle out, extracted some blood from the vial because it was still liquefied. And then if I go back up to the RAV4, they planted this blood here. Now, if you have it on a swab, I'm not an artist, but could you make squiggly lines with a swab? Maybe. That seems more explainable, I guess, or plausible than somebody wearing gloves, therefore no fingerprints, but then bleeding through the gloves somehow to leave blood that way. What do you think, Mr. Smith?
Yeah, so three things. One, it sort of relates back to last week's episode with OJ. We talked about the EDTA and the blood vial and things like that. So when you draw blood from someone and you're going to keep it in a vial, you got to have EDTA in the vial to keep it preserved so that it stays liquid, in liquid form, doesn't dry out. Two, the seal being broken and not replaced, that's that would be enough. Honestly, that would be probably enough to plant enough doubt in many minds of many jurors across the country for far less cases. And number three, the hole in the top of the vial, you can find plenty of people that say that's how we put the blood in the vial. We stick a needle in and we fill it up with. You can also find plenty of people and plenty of nurses, plenty of phlebotomists, people that do this kind of work, draw blood from people, to say that is not how we do this, and there should be no puncture in that. So again, we keep saying leave it up to your thought process. What does your logic tell you?
Yeah. So just two more pieces of evidence we want to talk about. The next one is Teresa Halbach was, her bones were found in his backyard. All right, so the next piece of evidence we want to get to is that Teresa Halbach, where her body was found. Her body was found mutilated and burned in a burn pit outside of Steven Avery's house. Now, again, his blood and DNA, sweat DNA, whatever you want to call it, found in the car places him there, and then her bones found outside his house. It looks like he kind of did it, but the burn pit was a huge open burn pit, and eyewitnesses did say that he had a huge bonfire on Halloween, on October 31st, when Teresa Halbach went missing. Now, even if he threw accelerants in there, like tires from the salvage yard, seats from the salvage yards, even if it was throwing lighter fluid on it, they had the bonfire that one evening for a few hours. It's very hard to burn a body. It's very hard, extremely hard to burn a body. It would be easier to burn a body in a small contained area, like a burn barrel. Now, there were some bones found behind Steven Avery's sister Barb's house in some burn barrels. That also is a little fishy, because if she was mutilated, her body was chopped up, and she was burned there, how would bones get in the burn barrel behind Barb's house right next to where Steven lives? So a lot of suspicious things there. And it's kind of hard to see from this picture here, but the charred bones and the fracturing of the bones, you can't do that with a giant open flame in a burn pit. You would have to burn the body for days to get that kind of effect, or burn them in a close proximity like a burn barrel or something else like an incinerator.
Yeah, I mean, there was bones found behind Steven. The majority of bones were found behind Steven Avery's house in the burn pit. Some of the bones were found in another burn barrel behind Steven's sister's house, which was in close proximity. And then I believe there was some pelvis or something found in a mile and a half away in a stone pit, gravel pit type thing.
Yeah, quarry,
that was
quarry, yeah.
said to be linked to Teresa Halbach. So bones are strewn all over the place. You could say that some sort of animal carried the pelvis that far. How did the bones get in the burn barrel? So lots of questions. But again, the biggest thing here is that it is scientifically, we'll come out and say that because we've actually researched some of this. It is almost impossible to burn a body to that magnitude where there's just fragments of bones in less than 24 hours in a open burn pit. It cannot be done. Even with accelerant, it just cannot be done.
Yeah, anyone who's a fan of the podcast Up and Vanish, which I think now is even a TV show on Oxygen Channel, the very first case they ever did was on Tara Greenstead, and she was murdered by a guy named Ryan Duke, and they burned her body in a pecan grove, and they said that they spent 3 days with no sleep, constantly putting accelerant on her body to burn it all the way to ash. So that's 3 days constantly having an open fire, constantly burning the body to have it go down to ash. This is a few hours in a huge open fire. It's next to impossible to have the results that we see. So the last thing I want to talk about for the evidence is Brendan Dassey. Brendan Dassey is the nephew of Steven Avery. He is Barb's son. So we were talking about how Barb lived next door to Steven. Brendan lived with her there. Brendan Dassey had a confession. That confession led investigators to go back and look in certain areas, certain parts of the property, and find more evidence. In the confession, he lays out that he and Steven Avery had Teresa Halbach tied to his bed, that they raped her, that they slit her throat, really gruesome details. And all this stuff was revealed to the public before the trial even began, which is a whole nother thing to talk about, because that is obviously contaminating the jury pool, because they're hearing all these grisly details before there was even a trial. But when they go back and look months later now after this confession at Steven Avery's property, that is when the key to the RAV4 is found in Steven's trailer. And that's even found really weird by a guy named Andy Coburn. And we'll talk about Andy Coburn in a little bit, but I want to show a clip from Brendan's confession, and I'll come back to it after, but I just want everyone to kind of see it and think, did he answer these questions, or was he led into these questions?
Come on. Something with the head. What else do you guys do? Come on.
No, Brendan. I know he made you do something else.
What was it?
That he punched you. Connor.
Cut her where?
On the throat.
Cut her throat. What else happens to her in her head?
Extremely, extremely important you tell us this. For us to believe you.
Come on, Brendan. What else?
We know, we just need you to tell us. That's all I can remember.
All right, I'm just gonna come up and ask you, who shot her in the head?
Okay. So, again, we'll just go over this. Brendan Dassey was somebody of limited intelligence. He actually was classified as a learning disability.
I just have a seat, Brendan.
Brendan Dassey was somebody who was classified as somebody having a learning disability. He was in special education classes. You saw him being interviewed without any kind of parent supervision or anything there, or a lawyer present, which also comes into question if that's even allowed. And they were asking him questions because when they examined the bones, they believed that there was some indentations in the skull that are consistent with gunshot wounds. So the police believe that she was actually shot, then her body was chopped up and then burned. So they were trying to just have Brendan tell them that, but you could see he was really confused about the questioning. And when they were saying, like, what did he do to the head? He was saying, cut her throat, cut her hair. And he was like searching for what they wanted. Like, he didn't know. And then, of course, he says, yeah, he shot her. And they're like, okay, good boy. Like, they were petting a dog. Yeah, good boy. That's what we want. Later on, which we can't show because we don't have enough time, they actually have that camera still rolling, and he actually is talking to his mother Barb and says, they got to my head, they got to me. I don't know. I don't know what I just said. And then he even says, now can I go back to English class? And the police are like, no, you're going to jail. You just confessed to murder.
Yeah, so we're dealing with a kid who doesn't even understand that what he just sort of confessed to would hinder him from going to English, going back to class. So, you know, we're not law enforcement here, but and believe me, we're not insinuating that the Manitowoc Police Department is anything like the rest of the law enforcement community, because you know every job or every community, every professional situation, occupation is going to have, you know, some screw ups here and there.
Speaking of screw ups, should we talk about Andy Coburn?
Yeah, Andy Coburn. We'll talk about him next. But yeah, this is it's definitely a situation where they didn't. You can plainly see they didn't get what they were wanting from Brendan, and they just sort of planted the and you know, we talk a lot about planted evidence here, but they literally planted the idea that someone shot her in the head. And to be honest with you, they're not 100% sure themselves. That sort of goes back to the bullet in the garage where one of the detectives says to the DNA, we put her in the garage because we found a bullet. I mean, it's levels upon levels upon levels of things that just don't make sense, of how they were collected and added up in this case. You know, if you don't ask any questions or you don't have any logical thought process, then yeah, it all makes sense. Found a bullet and she was killed with a bullet. Found a bullet in Steven Avery's garage. Yep, let's lock him up and throw away the key because he's a bad dude. However, when you look at some of the other things like no fingerprints in the car, no blood evidence, no evidence of Teresa Halbach, period, inside the trailer other than that key that they found after the 8th or 9th search. We're talking about a trailer that's, you know, not many square feet here. It's a very, very small trailer, and groups of individuals were searching that trailer for 8, 9, 10 days, and they don't find this key, which happened to be on the in the back of like a nightstand,
bookshelf.
Bookshelf kind of thing. It after the 8th search, just bizarre, very bizarre.
So getting into Andy Coburn now. So we talked about the Penny Bernstein case and that the Steven Avery bill, where wrongfully convicted people are going to start getting different compensation, and he was also suing Manitowoc County. Because of that, and because of this murder case, Manitowoc County was told they could not be involved. All they could do was give resources, as in any kind of technology, any kind of equipment or something that the Calumet County, which is a neighboring county, was going to need to use during this investigation. What you'll find in the documentary and anything else you research, Manitowoc County did not stay out of it. Did not just give resources and give materials and things like that. And one guy who was in it the whole entire time was this guy named Andy Coburn. He interviewed Steven Avery a bunch of times. He was investigating the trailer a bunch of times. He was the one who found that key on the 8th or 9th search, like Mr. Smith said, which is kind of strange, but does put Steven Avery again around the car and the RAV4 car and things like that. Also, he did some documentation, Andy Coburn, on the Penny Bernstein case. Not when the case was ongoing. He wrote a memo the day after Steven Avery got out that he had heard or got a phone call while he was a dispatcher that they might have the wrong guy in jail years and years and years before Steven Avery got out, that the other assailant, who was the guy who really did it, another police department had him in custody, and he was confessing to the Penny Bernstein rape, and Andy Coburn just kind of left it there. But the day after Steven Avery got out, he made a memo that he did receive that call. So very suspicious things that Andy Coburn seems to always do. He always seems to find evidence at the right time. He always seems to be at a place at the right time. And Mr. Smith is going to share something right now that's also very convenient in regard to Andy Coburn.
So we're going to wrap this episode up with this, and then we'll see you again in part 2. But I'll share my screen here and show you our buddy Andy Coburn. So this is Andy Coburn, and I'm going to play for you a police sort of a dispatch call that Andy Coburn called into the sheriff's department requesting a run on a plate number. So if you're a sheriff's deputy and you're out and about and you want to know if this particular license plate is connected to something shady, we'll say, you call in and you run the license plate. And so this is what the call was.
Manitowoc County Sheriff's Department, this is Lynn.
Lynn.
Hi, Andy.
Can you run Sam William Henry 582? See if it comes back for that.
Sam William Henry 582. I need Tarzan, please. All righty. You speak any Spanish there, Andy? I'm just going to call him the top of the list since mine on call didn't call me back. And when I get in trouble, Andy, I get in trouble. You know, what am I supposed to do?
Yeah.
My favorite one is in the city of Manitowoc. Yes. Okay, it shows that she's a missing person, and it lists to Teresa Hallback.
Okay.
Okay, that's what you're looking for, Andy?
99 Toyota.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
You're so welcome. Bye-bye.
He calls in this, so Sam William Henry is SWH, you know, so that's their call signals for the license plate. And it comes back to a Teresa Hallbach, and he, of course, knows 99 Toyota. She didn't give him that information. He had that information. And so why would he do this? There's one of two things. What Andy Coburn says is that he got this information and he was just out patrolling, and it just dawned on him that, you know, boy, I better have this information right. Should I run into a situation where I find the car or whatever? And so he was just double checking. He was like, you know, I got this information. I don't know if I wrote it down correctly. I don't know if I got, you know, I just want to double check to make sure I have this information, missing persons, license plate, just in case I run into the car. Scenario one. Scenario two is that he's standing in front of a car that he's not 100% sure is hers, and he's going to call it in. And basically he found the Toyota. He knew where the Toyota was. Now, this call had taken place well before they found the Toyota in the junkyard, in the salvage yard. And so that, once again, doesn't add up. There's so much that doesn't add up in this case. You know, you want to say from the last case of OJ, you want to say that they did some things that were incorrect. They may have planted some evidence, whatever. Fine. Believable. Whether it happened or not, who knows? Might not never prove it. There's a ton of shady business going on here. We haven't even gotten into the sign-in, sign-out log of the searching the salvage yard where Lieutenant Lank, who another kind of a shady individual, worked for Manitowoc, didn't sign in, said he signed in, but didn't sign in. On the stand, he said that he signed in at a certain time, which would have been dark. It just, so many things in this that they can't explain away other than we're law enforcement. You believe us. Steven Avery's a bad dude. So just believe that. And there's nothing to see here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that's kind of what led to, again, I'm not saying that they did plan anything, but I think some police officers, if they did do that, were justifying it by saying, listen, this is a bad dude. It's a bad family. They're always running in and having problems with the law. We got to get this guy off the street. It looks like he did this. Maybe we need to help it a little bit to make sure he goes away. And I think that should just lead us right into our opinions and wrap up this episode. And I'm going to go a little different. I'm actually not going to talk about Steven Avery. I'll save Steven Avery for next episode when we talk about season 2. But I'm going to talk about Brendan Dassey. I showed you the clip of the confession. I personally believe if you watch the whole thing and listen to it from beginning all the way to the end where Brendan's talking to his mother, that's a forced confession. And it just is too convenient for me that after that confession is given, they go back and search the property again for, at that time, was like the 14th time that they've, and I'm not exaggerating there, that they searched the property, and they all of a sudden found clues like the bullet and the key and all these things that really helped get Steven Avery convicted, that Brendan Dassey was a pawn in all this. And unfortunately, he's still in jail today. And in my opinion, he's collateral damage, and I think Brendan Dassey is innocent. They used him because he was in limited intelligence. They used him because his family is limited intelligence. They don't know laws, and they're able to use him to get that forced confession to get Steven Avery away. And I think Brendan Dassey is innocent and should not be in jail.
My whole opinion on this case is, if you're interested, and that's what our justice system should be. At the height of the justice system, it should be trying to look into what really happened, trying to answer the question of what really happened, who really killed Teresa Halbach, to bring some sort of justice and closure for the family. I just don't think they were interested in the truth here. I don't think they were interested in what really went down from the prosecution on up through the legal system. There's evidence of mishandling and misconduct in some of the upper reaches of the Wisconsin Supreme Court, all the way up to the Supreme Court. So, that's kind of my. Do I think he's a great guy, an upstanding, gentleman of the society? Probably not. I don't think I would want to go to dinner with Steven Avery, but that doesn't make him a killer.
All right, so I think that's all we have for this part of actually a 3-part Steven Avery series we're going to do. We're going to have a bonus one in a little while too for you guys. But this has been another episode of Case by Case with the Serial Thrillers featuring Steven Avery. And what do we always say, Mr. Smith?
We solve them all till we solve them all. We haven't quite solved this one yet, but stay tuned for next week's.
See you next time.